Okay, now we're going to be looking at lighting in UE4. So we briefly talked about lighting before. We've talked about the different kinds of lighting, the different kinds of lights in general. We talked a little bit about light baking, but we're going to go into a little more detail about the light and each one of its functions. And if you want a general overview of like lighting a scene well, I would recommend opening up one of the content, or not the content examples, but one of the other projects that is visually appealing to you, opening it up and seeing how they lit their scenes. All right, this is the number one way to find out how the professionals are doing, is just opening up their work and taking a look at it. So the first light is a point light. We know about this really well. There's one point of light. Light radiates in every direction from that point. If you want to change the brightness or the size of the influence area of this light, all you have to do is click on it and you can scale it. This is baked in shadow, so I want to leave it for now. Next one is spotlight. Similar, but it directs the flow of the light. There is actually something else that's really cool. It's the IES textures. We'll get to that, but it's basically changing the shape of how this is being lit. And then we have the directional light, which is above our scene right now. If we look out, it's simulating the sun. It's coming in through this hole, and it does sunlight really well. There's not many other reasons to use a directional light unless you're using another one to kind of complement one, but this is kind of an older technique, and nowadays we would use a skybox. So it has shadows. The shadows influence the geometry in the level. It's pretty simple. The next thing we're going to look at is the different kinds of shadows. So if we look at this light and we look at these objects, we can see the different kind of objects and how they react to the light. So this is a static light, which means it'll only give shadows on static objects. So the way we check if an object is static or not, you click on it and look at the details window, and then under the mobility there's a static and movable. So if you have an object in your scene and you know it's never going to move, you would set it to static. If it has to be dynamic, it's something that moves, like a car or a person or something like that, you would have to set it to movable. Also, if it has any kind of physics placed on it, so if this was like a barrel or a crate or something that you shoot and would like roll down the hill or something, it would have to be set to dynamic. But we can see that a static light will not cast shadows on dynamic objects because it knows this is going to move, so it's not going to cast shadows where it might not be there. So you can have a scene that's fully lit by static lighting and have dynamic objects in it. You're just not going to have shadows for that object. Back in the day, this was commonly used because dynamic lightings are expensive, and at the time computers weren't good enough to handle it. But nowadays we have a new system, and this is called stationary light. So what a stationary light does is not only calculates shadows like a static light, but it also provides real-time dynamic shadows. So the benefit of this is that it'll calculate the lighting information and the shadows for every static object in the scene. And the only dynamic shadows it's creating is for movable objects. And typically you have a lot less objects which are movable. So you save yourself a lot of compute time because you don't have to compute dynamic shadows for a static object. So this is kind of in the middle, best of both worlds kind of a light. By default, pretty much every light that you create in UE4 will be set to stationary. The way that we bake shadows is using Cascade system, and we'll get into that next week. But there is a difference between baking your shadows in and having dynamic ones. So the next light we look at is set to movable, which means everything is dynamic about it. So I can go ahead and start moving this, and you can see that every shadow, no matter what it is, static or dynamic, the shadow will be in real time. Now this is an important light for a lot of game types. Think about any kind of source of light that's moving, this is what you'll use. Of course, the computational cost of a movable light is quite a bit more than a static, and especially a movable light rather so basically it's the most expensive out of all these. Stationary light's like right in the middle, it's the sweet spot, and a static light is almost being phased out at this point. It's very, very uncommon to have a full game with hardly any dynamic objects. So anyways, movable light, dynamic shadows. And these shadows are still using the cascade system, but it's the dynamic cascade system. And we can actually see some of those functions under light. And you see minimum roughness, light fall off exponent, shadow bias. It's pretty interesting settings to play around with. Cast translucent shadows, indirect lighting. This is for bounce lighting, which we'll talk about maybe later in the week. Actually, we might do that on Thanksgiving, so stay tuned for that. And yes, this cast dynamic shadows, this has to be clicked on, otherwise you're not going to get the real-time movable. So it's possible to have a movable light that just doesn't cast any shadows. This can be pretty useful if you look at games like Watch Dogs. So Watch Dogs, when it was released on PC, it had movable lights on every single one of the cars. And the cars were they weren't using point lights, but they were using like a spotlight. And people were kind of mad because they weren't casting any shadows, and then people went in and adjusted the code and were able to enable those shadows. So this kind of technique is still used in the industry, a movable light with no shadows. Calculating shadows with a movable light is much more expensive than this method without shadows. But of course, depending on your usage, you might want shadows. I always prefer shadows. So what's next in the next room? Yes, more interesting things. So this is what I was talking about earlier. This is the IES light profiles on a spotlight. So if I click on the spotlight, we can see that the cone influence, there's an inner cone influence and an outer one. And this is helped being driven by an image. If I double click on this image, oh, that's right, it's kind of a weird shape. Well, you can kind of see it down here in the editor. It has defined edges in the light. And this is something that we'd use for like a flashlight or something. You can even set it to movable and move it around and see that this has much more going on than a standard light. And what this is doing effectively is simulating what you would see in a light with a reflector behind it. So like in a flashlight, there's a mirror behind the bulb which helps focus more of the light out. But it's never super perfect soft light. It's usually got some weird artifacts going on. And that's what this is simulating. And you'll see this in pretty much any kind of lamp installment. So it helps add a lot of detail into a scene when you have lights like that. So the next thing we're looking at is a light function. So if we click on this, we can see that there's a light function material. If I double click on this, we can bring up, actually this is the material instance. I'll bring up the actual material. I'll double click on that real quick. And we can see that there's a couple things going on. First thing we have is a texture. And what this is doing, there is a time. So this is like a tick, which means like every frame it'll advance time. And then there is panning animation. So what it's doing is adding a panner, which means it's going back and forth. And using a sine wave means it's going to go one way and then the other, or one way and then the other. And then this is also using a flicker. And this is just using it is multiplying a sine wave, which is the back and forth, by a fraction, which is then calculating variable brightnesses. And then this is all plugged into a switch, and these are we'll get into this maybe later on. This is more of an advanced tool. But essentially, this is all being plugged into the emissive, and the emissive is generating light. So with all that added together, you get a light which is animated. So you can think of how this might be effective if you have like a lamp, and that lamp is swinging back and forth and turning back and forth. Instead of rendering real-time shadows, what you could use is a light function to simulate kind of the shadows of like what you would see, like something that that reminds me of is Bioshock Infinite. Whenever it has lights and those lights are moving, it's almost always a light function similar to this. Next room, exponent. So we look at exponent. This is basically, where is it? Let's use this search tool. Exponent. Excellent. So what the exponent is calculating how soft the light will be based on distance. So we look at this one. It's set to 1, which means that it's very bright, and it doesn't get very soft. There's basically like a cutoff point, and this is based on the size of this light. This light is the same size, but its exponent is set to 8, which means there's a softer transition from the brightest point to the softest point. So just another tool to change the visual quality of the lights. By default, lights are usually set to inverse square. So if I click inverse square, it instantly becomes darker. And what inverse square is a real-world calculation of light, which means the farther light gets, the darker it gets. Inverse square is the actual real-world calculations of light. So if you want the best quality looking lighting, you will use inverse square. And this is a brand new tool that only came out in the last couple of years. I think Fox Engine that handles Metal Gear Solid was one of the first to use inverse square. So the next thing we're looking at is inverse square fall off. Oh, that's the thing we were just talking about. So we can see that this one is set at exponential, which means it's kind of simulating what inverse square does, but it's not quite perfect. And we can see over here, inverse square working properly. This is more visually correct. So next thing we're going to look at is indirect lighting. And this is something that's really cool that's been being tweaked and still kind of affected. So this is not real-time indirect lighting. So this is baked in. If we take a look at that, you can see that because if we look at the static object, the indirect lighting is only affecting this side, and it's being shadowed by itself. But a dynamic object is not doing that. There is a way to enable dynamic indirect lighting, but like I said, that's something that we'll have to get into later. So in this case, the static object is the more correct one because the lighting is being calculated correctly. But what we have right here is just a light that's encased in a square, which is casting light rays, and then the light rays are being bounced off of this white surface and then coming back on anything that's close to it. So the same thing as indirect, our global illumination and indirect lighting that we've used before, but in UE4. And this can add a lot of cool detail to a level. So let's move on. Source radius. So what this is doing, and if we click on it, it's hard to see. Oh, I guess it's probably set to 0. So source radius. If a source radius is set to 0, what you're basically doing is making the light, the source of the light, very, very, very tiny. So if you think about lights that have a very tiny source radius, LEDs. LEDs are a perfect example because they're very, very small, and the light is coming from a very, very specific point. And what this does in this case is cast very sharp shadows. If you have something that has a much bigger area and you're thinking about how light travels, it's being blocked much more softly. So we see the shadows coming from this tiny light is a very good like outline of the shape, because the source radius of this light is so large and the light's coming in from more directions. That makes the shadows softer and more of a blob. So you have to consider where your light's coming from when you install a light like this in your scene. Is it coming from like a very small light, like an LED on a switchboard or something? Or is it coming from like a big fireplace? That's what this would represent. And we can see source radius with a really glossy surface really affects how it looks. So you can excuse me. So once again, source radius of this light is set to 0, which makes it really small. And this is the smallest highlight that you'll ever get in UE4. And whereas this one's set to 150, you can see that the source of the light is really big. So this is doing the same thing as over here, but this is kind of in a glossy reflection type situation. Source length. This is something that was actually just added in not too long ago. So if we type in length, what it's basically doing is rendering, instead of a point, it's rendering a line. So think about what kind of lights do this. You know, the perfect example is fluorescent lights. So in UE4, if you were doing a fluorescent light, you would want to increase the source length. So if I change this to something like 10, hit enter, you can see that it's kind of just mostly square. If I change it to like 50, it starts getting more length. And you can actually change this. Oh, I thought you could change this in real time. Oh yeah, there you go. And you can see how to change the length just like that. So source length of just the normal lights are set to 0, so just 1 point, but you can change it to a bar. And maybe in the future they'll add even more shapes. We'll just have to wait and see. And very last, source radius with roughness. So roughness is a parameter within a material, PPR materials, and we can see that it's basically doing the same thing that we were looking over here, but in a more realistic looking way. So LED once again, and larger light source, except with, instead of the source size being small, this is the source radius, or source radius. Yeah, so it's the same thing. What's next? Oh, we have, I think, one more room. Yes, last room. So this is starting to talk about shadows some more. So if we look at the one on the left, we see self-shadowing accuracy. So what's self-shadowing accuracy? What that is when an object has complicated geometry and it's casting shadows on itself, this is dictating the quality of those self-shadows. So we look here, and you can see there's quite a bit of popping when we move back and forth, and that's because the accuracy is set really low. In fact, it's set to 0, which means it might even be disabled. Not what you want to see in a game. If we come over to the other side, we can see that the self-shadowing is being handled quite a bit better. Better contact shadows, yes. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to notice the difference between these. And then the last one we're going to look at is shadow filter sharpen. So what this is doing is basically calculating the edges of a shadow and how soft it's going to be. So the filter sharpen set to 0 means we're going to get the kind of the softest shadows that we're going to possibly be able to get. And if we sharpen those, we'll start to see really direct shadows, like very, very detailed, sharp shadows. So in this case, we've kind of reversed what would be soft and what would be hard. So this would be kind of the fireplace where the light's coming in from all angles. You would kind of have some light bleeding in from the sides. There wouldn't be as hard shadows. And then you have something that has a very small source radius. You could also enable this feature to enhance the sense of the light's coming from a very small point. And that's it. And it's daytime. So yeah, lighting is one of those things that it takes a lot of time to get used to. And there's a lot of tricks of the trade that are becoming less relevant. So you guys are in an interesting time right now where the rules aren't necessarily written. The tools that we have are new. The limits of PCs are being pushed all the time and changing faster and faster. So the only really way to learn these rules is to set them yourself. So experiment with these lights, try and simulate what you're looking for. And you're going to be, some of the first to do that. You're going to find what the limits are of the system and what's best. Because a lot of the people that do know this probably might not share or, have to be asked. And you just kind of want to be the first people to know. So yeah, if we take a look at a more interesting looking scene, let's see. Actually, what? Let's talk about reflections as well. Reflections kind of go in with lighting. Let's build my shaders real quick. Alright. So reflections on a metallic surface. All of these are being generated with the PBR system. If we look at reflections, this is what we call screen space reflections. And this is a really cool new system that calculates reflections based on geometry and what's being rendered already in the scene. So this is a really cool way of getting really detailed and precise reflections. Something like this was not possible even like 2 years ago. So we can see with the smoothness of 0, or roughness of 0, so the smoothest mirror surface, you can see some of the issues with the system where it's a little bit pixelated and doesn't look exactly right. This is always being fixed, and maybe in the future it will be perfect. But for now, what we usually have to do is set the roughness to something a little bit lower than 0. So if it's set to 0.3, we still get a pretty shiny surface. It's not exactly chrome, but the reflections in this case will be, you won't get that grainy kind of sense. And then with a roughness of 0.8, you're basically getting no reflection data at all. It's very, very low. So we look at reflections on non-metallic materials, we get, similar things. Reflections on roughness 0, a little bit grainy, but pretty cool. Roughness at a 0.4, it's getting pretty hard to see the difference. And then at 0.8, it's basically chalk. Alright, so box reflection capture actor. So I think I'm going to have to simulate this. So what this is doing is basically it has a camera that's facing this way, and it's looking in this direction. And what it's doing is applying what it's seeing to a material. And it's doing this in real time. So what you end up getting is real-time reflections with more detail, and you can see things that are behind you. Whereas screen space reflections only reflect what's already in the screen. So something that this might be useful for is like if you're making a car game and you have like you have a mirror that's looking behind the car. Rear view mirrors, side view mirrors, that kind of thing. Or if you have like a video surveillance camera, you can render this onto a video screen and have a camera panning around and looking. Although you probably want to use a different method. So the sphere reflection capture is basically the same thing, but instead of capturing just one view, it's looking at all directions. And we're also seeing screen space reflections being added on top of this. So we see screen space reflections are pretty accurate, whereas the box actor is not fully accurate. You can see that screen space reflections stop when I start looking to the side. So it's all about accuracy. This is more accurate than this, but at least you get reflections this way. So when applied to a sphere, we can see screen space reflections. So this is standard screen space reflections. We can see that it works dynamically in real time. And this is really cool. If I was to grab this and I have to stop. If I was to grab this and move around, you can see that reflections are working in real time. It's pretty cool. But this does have limitations. We get the graininess, and it won't reflect things behind us. And once again, we have the scene capture cube, which is also dynamic. If we play again, we'll see that everything's moving in the image, but it's not grainy at all. This is much more computationally expensive, but it's got much better quality. Although it's not 100% accurate either. It's basically faking reflections as best as it can. And the last one, scene capture, 2D dynamic. So same thing as before, but this is doing it dynamically. Pretty cool. So you could use this as a mirror. You know, that'd be a perfect mirror. The character would see itself. So this is probably the one you'd want to use for a car, actually, rather than the static one. Alright, I think that's going to be it for our lighting and reflection section. Please download these and play with them and start kind of experimenting with your own stuff. It will add a lot of skill to your skill set, and it's really important for you guys to do that. So play around, kind of see what they can do, and just have fun. So last piece is going to be on materials. It's probably going to be the longest one because we're going to talk about making seamless textures in Photoshop. We're going to import those, and then we're going to plug them into a material and see how they affect things.